Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to do a very special resin pour. And to start this off, I have to cut down some foam. I'm going to make a underwater fantasy-esque resin scene, but I'm going to go for more of like a riverbed scene. Sort of like with tree branches and rocks and all that kind of stuff, and a little bit more greenery. And I'm starting off with my hot wire cutter and some XPS foam. This is just a standard XPS foam from our local hardware store. And I'm cutting it down to size to fit the mold. I chose a rectangular mold that has like this water texture on top, because I thought that would be quite fitting. And the purpose why I chose a water scene was that I knew that what I planned would lead to a decent bit of air bubbles, and I don't have a pressure pot, so I thought I'd just embrace it and go with water scene. I'm going to use a very liquid type resin that was set in like 4 or 5 days to give it more of a chance to get rid of some of the air bubbles, but I presume that there will still be a decent bit, so you know, without a pressure pot, why not embrace that and added to the scenery, so to speak. So I'm starting off by making like this backdrop and this floor wedge, and then I'm using some paper clay and filling in all the gaps. The reason why I'm choosing paper clay is because it usually bonds very decently with foam, and it also dries very light and is easy to smooth. I was debating on using some other types of clay, like epoxy or something, but in this case I'm needing quite a bit, and it's just easier to blend out the paper clay with some water than it is to work with sticky epoxy in this kind of setting. So I went with this. Now this is unfortunately where the first mistake happened. It looks a bit wonky. Basically what happened was I grew impatient after 2 days of waiting, and there were still some wet spots in the clay, which paper clay takes a decent while to dry, especially in a mud like this. So I tried to use my hot air gun, but it was apparently a little too warm, so the XPS foam shrunk. But I actually went with it and decided, okay, I'm going to fix this. I trimmed off the bottom to make that straight again, and then I removed the clay bits that I added before, and I put in some new clay to fill in all the gaps, and obviously I had to fill in the sides a little bit more, but in the end I think it worked out pretty well. And then I put it into my oven for a tiny bit, just to set the outside before I actually took it out of the mold, and then I let it dry for 2 more days. This was a very time intense project. It took me like multiple weeks of working on this on and off, but I think it was worth it in the end. After the clay was dried, I added some rocky bits, and for that I'm using a method that Nerdforge described pretty well. It is basically crinkled up aluminium foil that you pour some plaster over, and then you get these rock formations. And in the end you can like break them apart and use them as rocks. Now I need to seal all of this in, so I'm using this stone effect paste. Honestly, this is just paint and sand. I wanted to try this out like a while back, and I'm still having the tubes of that. It is nothing special, and it's way too expensive for what it is. I would just recommend get some acrylic pouring medium or some gesso and some acrylic paint, and just mix that with a little bit of sand or structure sand. You know, the like larger kernels that you can get for like painting on like canvases and stuff. But I decided to just use it up over time, so that is why I'm using it here. Next up, I wanted to add some more variation in texture, so I added some dirt. This is just some sand mixed with acrylic paint, water and glue, and it gives me this like earth look. But I'm going to paint it over anyways. These were just, again, leftover chunks from other projects, same with the rocks. And whenever I have like plaster or dirt left over, I just like let it dry in chunks or like pour it into aluminium foil mold things to like make some textured bits that I can add in other projects. It kind of reduces the waste, and it always makes it very easy when I need just some tiny pieces for other projects to like find what I need. Now next up was the base paint, and I'm going in with a technique that works pretty well with like rock formations, so I'm going to mix it in for a bit more of the dirt parts. So I have like 3 different gradients of brown, like a darker brown, a lighter, more leathery brown, and like a very dark brown, and then I have this green tone. And all of these, by the way, are very cheap acrylic paints. These are like the dollar store variety, but I found that for washes like this, where you just want like a stain, these are more than perfect, and they work really well. They may not be enough to like cover the entire surface in a base layer, and you may need multiple layers and then may leave like a weird kind of texture, but if you thin them out with water and use them as the wash, they're excellent. So I'm using them for like these darker washes on the rocks and for like the like more blendy little spot washes that I did for the background. And it's going to give it hopefully a bit more of a natural look. And then I'm going over the rocks with a little bit more wash and then like a dry brush before I add another wash and another dry brush to get like the effect I want. It actually took multiple layers, but that was just because, again, I'm using kind of cheap paint. But in the end, I was really happy with how they looked. Some of the rocks I wanted to look a bit more like a barky texture, and I think that was achieved pretty well. Now, of course, I also want to add a lot of greenery, so it's time to apply some PVA glue. I'm just using PVA glue straight here. Normally, like what you would do is thin it out with water a little bit, and then apply the like flocking, and then douse that in a little bit of IPA or like some kind of quick evaporating alcohol before then adding some watered down PVA glue on top to make things stick. In this case, I just went a bit rougher, added the PVA glue first, and then I pressed in this flocking. This is just some flocking that is kind of like sponge made, so it's like out of sponges that have been colored and then blended up. I think this one was from Woodland Scenics and came in like a large bottle at some point. But I'm just using leftovers here, so I'm not too sure. Anyways, I mainly like use the moss first on the surroundings before I go in with some glue and a toothpick, and I'm like particularly trying to only fill in the recessed areas of the like stones, and then I'm adding some more flocking, and this is the end result. Sadly, my camera didn't record while I was putting on the sticks, but it was basically just adding some sticks and cutting them down to size and then gluing them on. And then I'm adding some of this brushwork. Again, I have no clue which brand this is from. This is just in my model train stash that I've accumulated over years. And it's on little baggies that have no description on them. So this is like a kind of brushwork. It has like very thin branches in it and then like flocking mixed in. And you can use it for trees and brushwork. And I thought it would fit really well and like blend things together for this diorama. Plus it adds a little bit more volume. And in the end, I think it turned out really well. Now, after all that was dried, of course, I had to fix the wonkiness on the sides. So I used a bit of foam clay, and I'm later on going to use a little bit of spackle to fill this in. I knew that just spackle wouldn't quite do the trick yet, since there was a decent bit of unevenness. So I'm spreading out the foam clay all over before then cutting it off later. Most of this in the back is actually going to be cut off. I just decided to use more because the packages dry out immediately and I had nothing else to do with this. It's a really cheap foam clay that I, again, got at the dollar store, but it works super well. And it bonds really well with this foam. I will just have to later on use a sharp blade and shave off the excess. Now next up I need to prepare this leather fellow. Normally I wouldn't cast any of these animals in, I would give them a proper burial in the garden, but in this case I got this from a relative and they gave it to me specifically for casting him in, so you know, I went with it. He was basically a cellar find. This little fella just dried up after like old age, I guess, in a cellar. And yeah, they found him and they sent him over to me. Again, not something I would usually cast in, but yeah. In this case, he's gonna have a nice little green backdrop. And I, of course, needed to clean up some of the fluff and dirt he had on, but I'm just using tweezers, and I'm not gonna seal him, actually. He's so dried up that I didn't really want to touch him much, because I was afraid he was too brittle. Usually I would seal these kind of guys with like either resin or like a coat of varnish, just to make sure that like the surfaces are sealed and there's no air bubbles that would gather. But in this case I decided I rather not touch him too much, because I don't want any of his little fingers or feet to like break off. So instead I'm just going to use a very liquid resin when I cast him in and hope that will not damage him and seal him well enough, and I hope that he's dried out enough to where there's no problem with the curing. Now again, I'm just using some spackle here to fill in the rest of the gaps, and then I'm actually just going to sand this down before painting. The spackle needs a couple coats of paint because it's the kind of wall spackle that like comes in these like huge bags that you use for construction, and it kind of like needs a sealing coat because it likes to, especially with the moisture of the paint, flake off a little. So like every time you add a coat of paint and the previous one isn't fully dry, it like lifts it off a little and like leaves a white spot there where it hasn't been properly sealed. So, you know, this one you really need to seal in either with paint or best actually with like a coat of either Mod Podge or a decoupage glue, I guess. And that will really prevent things from flaking, but it's really excellent for smoothing the sides out since you can sand it so easily, and it like kind of behaves a little bit more like frosting in a way when you want to spread it with like a silicone spatula. So it's been my go-to for like most my models. Plus it dries really, really light, so it doesn't add any extra weight unlike some of the casting plaster stuff. Of course, I needed to blend everything in. I tried to not add the spackle too much to the sides. I should have probably smoothed it out before I added the front, but it worked out really well in the end. Like, I didn't ruin any of the front parts, and it, in the end, blended in almost seamlessly. So all I need to do is like add some more flocking on the edges and some more paint and decor, and then it was basically done. Now, I want to seal the stuff because I'm not too sure if just the paint is enough, so I'm using some gloss varnish, and this should hopefully also help remove air bubbles. Sadly, I had some green paint left on the brush I used, but it doesn't really matter in the end. This is going to be in the bag. As for the front, I am actually going over it with a final coat of watered down PVA, and I'm using a very thick coat, and I hope that this will like fill in some of the gaps there are. This, by the way, took like 3 days to dry, but I think it was worth it in the end. It added this like sheen, but you will have that in the end anyways when I pour the resin. It's just going to hopefully help make some of the surfaces a bit more rigid and less absorbent for the resin, so hopefully it's gonna minimize the larger air bubbles, though definitely not prevent the smaller ones. And then it was time to add this little guy in. It actually took a little while until I found the right position for him, but in the end I think he sits there quite cozy. I just really had to pay attention to his tail not sticking out too much. I measured every step of the way if he would fit into the diorama, so I was sure he would fit. I just needed him to like actually glue down in the place. That would be safe. And then it was time for the resin pour. So I added a thin coat of resin first, And then I'm using my lighter here to carefully pop the air bubbles on the surface. And this resin, by the way, it looks a bit purple because I used an anti-yellowing agent, and I like to tint my resin a tiny bit more purple, that when it stands in like sunlit areas, it's first gonna turn clearer before it starts yellowing at all. And you're gonna hardly even notice it at all, like when you look at the resin pores. So I'm starting off with the base pour in there, and then I'm coating the piece a little bit beforehand, just to help minimize air bubbles. I didn't realize I put on the like wooden outside box in the wrong way, because it has a little dip on the top, and it works really well for where the waves are, but for a straight bottom line it really like doesn't with the warp, it just presses it out. And yeah, that's my problem. Maybe I should have used a heavier clay or plaster, cause this thing floats. I could have predicted this, and I totally spaced out. So yeah, this is really unfortunate. Now that I have the resin pour, maybe I should have done a like smaller pour, like a very small pour on the bottom, and then poured the next layer. But I wanted to do this in one to really minimize the air bubbles and give them a chance to rise. Plus this resin takes several days to cure. I think this is Troll Factory resin, if I remember correctly, and it's a deep pour epoxy resin that like minimizes air bubbles. So yeah, I had to make a construction with like this little stick. It's just a popsicle stick covered in some bezel tape to help it not stick to the resin. And then I used some clamps on the side, and it actually worked pretty well. I had a little bit of lift off, but luckily from the front it's really not noticeable. And then once that was in like a almost hardened state, but still soft, I added the last layer to even it out a bit. This resin tends to sink a tiny bit, so it needed the last layer, but in the end, you know, you can hardly tell. The only reason why you can actually tell the separation is because there was some debris floating, but else you really cannot notice. Now I used a lighter there to get rid of like a little bump that I accidentally made while unmolding, because again, I like to unmold my resins where they're decently soft still, so I can trim off the excess easily. But yeah, just a little bit of warmth helped, and I just had my lighter there, so that's what I used. And here you can see the final pour. You will notice that there's a tiny gap on the side and on the bottom in the back, but when you look from the front, you can practically not notice at all, and it actually looks really good. The waves on top, when the light shines through them, definitely add this very mystical underwater scene. And actually, there is not many large air bubbles at all. Like, the only air bubbles that accumulated are actually not really air bubbles, they are debris. Like the white stuff that's floating that looks like air bubbles that kind of separates the two pouring layers. That's debris that came up from... You can tell like there's a spot right where this little lizard salamander fellow is, and then like some from the moss I added later. So I think there will just have been like some little dirt and dust particles, but it really looks like air bubbles, and I think it actually looks quite good, so I'm not mad about this at all. And this little fellow, it looks so cute in there. And I think I hit this like underwater river scene pretty well, and I just love how mystical it looks with like all the greens and stuff. Kind of like you're on the edge of a forest and there's just a little lake or a little river, and you look down in the water and you see this little fellow. You know, I can't imagine that he was sunbathing there and then just peacefully passed, and then over time, you know, the water rose and he just stuck there in place. Like, not disrupted by his calm sleep he has. So yeah, overall I'm super happy. Again, I would have loved to not have the debris. I actually tried to like get some of the debris away, but it was really hard to see all of the debris rising, and especially towards the end when I had it curing in my little curing box, like I shone a light on it and I removed a bit of the larger ones, but yeah, all of these tiny ones I just couldn't really see. I guess that's where like maybe just like skimming off the entire top coat would have helped. But yeah, overall it turned out really well. I have like 1 or 2 larger air bubbles that you cannot really see too much between the rocks, but honestly they fit the scene very well and they're not like in the way of anything, so I'm totally fine with it. And the surface turned out super glossy and perfect, and the edges aren't warped or anything, so all of this worked out super well with the pores. Again, you can see the separation layer, but only from the side, so I would say definitely a huge success. And this was actually one thing I always wanted to do. And I'm going to definitely make more of this kind of pour in the future, because I'm seeing all these like really fancy and epic lamps on like Etsy and Instagram, where people use like wood pieces and pour them into the resin, or like this some other scenery pieces. And I really love the look, and this guy actually looks really pretty on the windowsill when the sun shines through just the top. It's just really hard to get a proper picture. In the video it managed to focus on him, but like in pictures it's so reflective because the resin is like so clear that like any light I shine on it to try and light him up, except from the top, is like really making my camera struggle. But I think you can really tell how he looks from just the video alone. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this rather long project. Again, this took me almost a month to finish. And let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts of this are. And of course, as always, I hope you have a great day. See you next time. Bye bye!